Audio Jungle.
Good morning. My name is Jim, and welcome to CPOL News. What a wonderful morning, is it not? Well, unfortunately, today is just like any other difficult day for the people of Somalia. Let's get right into our exclusive report over today's topic, state capacity. Austin, can you take us through what's going on down there? Thank you, Jim. Somalia has been under decades of conflict. The Somali Civil War is an armed conflict that started in 1991, following the overthrow of the dictator Siad Barre. The main causes of the Somali conflict are competition for resources and power, the colonial legacy, and repression by the military regime. After years of not having a government that could properly control its territory, there was hope in 2012 when a new constitution and government was formed. But now we see the truth, as you can see behind me. There are no significant changes, and it is clear in the absence of a central government, Somalia continues to be a failed state. Now back to you, Jim. Thanks, Austin. It's very difficult to measure a state's strength, which correlates with the term state capacity. And as we just saw, Somalia lacks state capacity, which makes it a failed state. But what is state capacity? What allows states to implement decisions? And how do we measure all this in the first place? Well, fortunately, our new news segment, Information Explained, is just a few moments away. We have an expert in comparative politics to help establish some basic understanding. But before all that, we will be right back after this short commercial. Does filling up gas take a long time? Are gas prices insanely high? Are you mad? Are you upset about all of this? Well, maybe you should give the double bicycle a try. The double bicycle can take you anywhere a car can, and only for $199. Services and conditions apply, shipping and handling sold separately. Welcome back. We will now hear some words from our expert. James, how are you doing today? Thanks, Jim. I'm doing great. Well, first, let's understand what state capacity is. There are many contested definitions, but the professional definition is that state capacity refers to the ability of the state to penetrate civil society in order to implement political decisions throughout the territory. However, a bit more of a basic definition would be that state capacity is the level to which the leader of a state can implement chosen policies. Now, there are large differences between what a state does and what a state could actually do, which makes it difficult to actually measure state capacity. But luckily, we do have specific measures to help provide an answer of some sort. But James, what allows a state to actually implement a law? I'm sure many people tuning in must have the same question. Well, there are three things that help states implement decisions: funding, bureaucrats, and information about the population. Let's break them down piece by piece. Let's start with funding. In order for states to implement and execute the law, there has to be some source of funding. It makes sense to build roads, to have the military, to have people that work for the government. All these things require some sort of money. And there are two main sources of funding: taxes and non tax revenue. And non tax revenue can be things such as natural resources or foreign aid. Fiscal capacity is the state's ability to actually extract those taxes from the population. Now, all these things work hand in hand. Funding, bureaucrats, and information work together to build state capacity. Take this for example. If you want to collect taxes, you need tax collectors. And you also need to pay these tax collectors from the taxes that you raise. And similarly, you need information about your population so you know who and how much an entity owes in taxes. That's why these three things are important measures for state capacity. One measure that comes from taxes, for a measure of state capacity, are the actual taxes collected as a percentage of GDP. And is this a reliable measure, James? Well, there are strengths and weaknesses to this measure, as there are with any other measure, basically. One possible weakness is that fiscal capacity doesn't take into account a country choosing to tax at a higher rate compared to another country that may have adequate resources and then taxes at a lower rate. Simply put, country A may have natural resources to depend on for revenue, and because of these natural resources, they can tax their population at a lower rate, whereas country B may not have these natural resources to depend on, and that's why they have to tax their population at a much higher rate. And so this makes this measure a lot more situational, dependent on the state's case. Whereas an enormous strength for this measure is that taxes are quite readily accessible, and in terms of the information, you can find tax brackets almost anywhere online, and countries publish this sort of information. So there's nothing really to dispute there about how much a tax bracket is for a certain population. But now let's talk about bureaucrats, who are essentially state employees. There are quite a few things that matter for this case. You need a proper amount of workers in the public sector depending on the size of the population, and these workers also need to be allocated across the state in a way that makes things accessible for the population. And the people themselves also need to be skilled. In order to have a high state capacity, these things are essential. You can't have a tax collector sitting behind a desk who's lazy when people need to pay their taxes. That's just an example of many. Corruption also plays a huge part in this because it's like saying you're only as good as your team. If your team is corrupt, then it's going to be hard to make things happen. Which is why corruption is also another measure of state capacity. The measure is the percentage of survey respondents who paid a bribe for a public service. So a high percentage in this case would mean that a lot of public officials took a bribe for their service, whereas a low percentage of state capacity would mean that money doesn't exactly dictate who has to follow the law. Everyone is binded by the law, thus creating a high state capacity. So essentially, to put it in the most basic terms possible, if government officials are corrupt, then there's essentially a low state capacity. But if government officials are not corrupt, then there's a high state capacity by this measure. Well, thank you so much for the brilliant explanation, James. We now have another expert to help educate us about the information gathering side from the government. Here we have the director of the US Census Bureau. Mark, can you hear me? Yes, Jim, I hear you loud and clear. Thanks for having me on the show. State information is key in collecting taxes, regulating policies, and much more. But some of you may be wondering, how is information gathered by governments? Well, many local governments in the United States collect information via electronic questionnaires. The IRS receives copies of income reporting statements from employers to keep track of how much each citizen is making. And another example would be the US Census Bureau collecting information about the population and demographic components of change, such as births, deaths, and migration. These are just few examples of how the government gathers information to be able to implement policies. Back to you, Jim. Thanks, Mark. Well, that's it for our special news segment, Information Explained, in which we covered state capacity today. I hope everybody had a chance to learn what state capacity is, what allows states to actually implement decisions, and how state capacity is measured. Tune in next week for the next segment, and that's it for today. My name is Jim. Have a great rest of your day.